Okay.
I see it.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh,
Okay,
fantastic photo.
Yes, I scoured the internet for a good picture of Proxima Centauri because Badu references it.
Why not a picture of Quebec?
Yeah, there's
not so sublime, right?
Not as sublime.
What's a picture of Quebec? Like, how do you take a picture of Quebec, really? I mean,
like maybe a picture of a map of Quebec just on the corner.
Yeah, you know what? Internationally, you should have a picture of poutine, right? Because this is the big invention of Quebec. And since we like so much to talk about dishes, poutine is the thing, right? That it's international about Quebec.
Yes.
Yes, it's the universal relation.
Yeah. Like I have a bunch of fries right here. Like you just have to put some gravy on, and you have poutine. So.
For a second, I thought you were talking about Putin, but okay, makes more sense.
Yeah. Well, I always wanted to taste this thing, poutine, but we don't have it here, so I have to improvise someday something.
Great. So yes, last time we went on a excursion through the mathematics, and so we'll use some of that here. But I mean, I don't have a ton of formalism. A lot of this part of the book is kind of a recap, and the relations themselves, they don't really have that much content on their own. Like Badu insists a lot that relations, they don't modify existence, and they don't modify, what we've been calling like the internal relations of an object. So I think it'll be up to us to try to make something more tangible, extract something tangible from the concept of relation, because it doesn't inherently have a lot. And in fact, I mean that's a unique part of Badu's philosophy, right? That we've commented on, is that for him, once you've reached this scale of his philosophy, or the scale of phenomenology, you've kind of exhausted what is the let's say the informational content, or the content of differences that that is phenomenologically, meaningful. So yeah, so let's do that. A recap here. So first, Badu tells us that existence is not a being, but rather a configuration of being. So you guys remember existence being this assigning of the identity of an element to itself, right? Identity of A with regards to A, let's say, some element A. And so this quote says, existence is not, right? It's not a being itself, but an indexing. And then, but nevertheless, the fact that something can exist means that it implies a new consistency on being, right? Which is the retroaction, the transcendental functor, which assigns a new ordering to being, right? Which begs the question, like, what was the old ordering such that there is now a new consistency, right? Well, if you look at being an event already, Badu tells us that the belonging, the inclusion relations already is a type of consistency, right? So in some sense, the new consistency of existing is like a new relation that's neither belonging nor inclusion. It's a third type of relation that which we know is like a partial order relation. And then the second thing is every existence presupposes an inexistent. So this is another thing he introduces in this section, but I mean, it was kind of implied previously. In order for something to exist, in order for a world to exist, that means or rather multiple worlds. So a world instead of one world. In order for that to be the case, there had to be some things that don't make it into the world, right? A particular world must have some things that don't exist. This claim actually is a little stronger than that. It's saying that within every object, among its elements, there must also be an inexistent. So it's not only that certain objects don't appear, or something like that, right? Certain things are not indexed to the transcendental, but it's that within anything that is indexed, there must be something in it that is inexistent. And this is also kind of implied by the transcendental functor, because we know that the functor assigns for every degree in the transcendental a multiple. And we know that one of the degrees is the minimum, or the nil degree. So whatever is assigned to that must be inexistent, right? Have existence of nil. Okay. And then Badiou gives us this really nice overview of everything so far, which is he terms it the analytic portion of his book, right? Next will be this kind of synthetic portion, but for the analytic portion, this is the last part, right? Relations with the greater logic. So how does this work? So we have the multiples, right, from being, and so we could just read this like we write these multiples, and then the only thing we really know about multiples is that they can contain more multiples in them. There is a certain cardinality to each one of them, and then the total thing that underlies a world is an inaccessible cardinal, which he doesn't really go into at this point yet, but we can talk more about the inaccessible cardinal. And then,
sorry, because that's also something that I find it weird in this chapter, right? Because as you said, the singular claim is actually a claim about the weakness of relations, right? I mean, as he said, it's a conservative thesis about relations, which is, that's the novelty of it in a certain sense. And then you have two strong claims, but are kind of inverse, right? The claim about the inexistent, which is very important for what comes later. And at the same time that you have a claim about, let's say, relations are kind of weak, worlds are kind of weak in a certain sense. There's something that is inexistent in every object. You have this very strong claim about, the infinity of worlds and the sort of closure, right? That closure is not closure in the sense of a weakness, but it's the closure in the sense of there is no operation you can make inside of the world that takes you outside of it, right?
Yeah. Right. So the inaccessibility is almost like saying the outside is inaccessible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's a weakness, but it's also a all-encompassing thing. So it's inaccessible in two senses, let's say, right? You cannot get out of the world. And because you cannot get out, that also means that the cardinality itself is somehow like, it's basically inaccessible. It cannot be, there's no position from which you can see this set, this multiple. So I mean, some examples I was thinking about. So we'll get into this, but already one example that I had in mind was the idea of moving like a piece of art. I mean, we talked about this before, but like moving a piece of art into the art gallery, right? Before an object, let's say an ordinary object moved to an art gallery, takes on some artistic quality, right? So for Badiou, I would like to ask or put forward the question, how in what sense can we say this makes it an art object? Right? Because he already said that it's the internal relations that make the object what it is, and external relations, for example, the fact that the environment is a museum or a gallery or installation, that's an external relationship. So how is it that we can make sense of that kind of effect, right? Because we know, that's a huge class of phenomena that because of where they are located, they take on a certain quality.
Yeah, but I think that you said the crucial word, which is localization, right? The crazy thing, what I feel like it's a very important aspect of this chapter to keep in mind is that the distinction between object and relation is actually the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic relations, right? It's not the distinction between something steady and constituted and its placement in a space. Because if that's the case, I think then we would be on a dead end with what you just asked, right? How can it be that relations are not constitutive if localizing an object in an art gallery changes, let's say, its status into an art status? And I think that the very fact that to describe this, you need to talk about localization and how, let's say, how parts of this, how the very components of the object are connected with the rest of the stuff that is in the museum. Right?
Yeah, yes, that's a good point. But I think that implies something which we're about to get to, which is that objects, whenever you see two objects that seem to be separate, for example, like something you bring into an art gallery and the art gallery itself, right? You can take them apart, right? They can be considered as two separate objects, but you can also consider the object that is comprised of both of them as an object. Mm-hmm. So this operation or this composition of objects, of combining objects together to form new objects, that's what is going to allow us to think exactly this localization.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because localization can happen between two separate objects. It can only happen within a single object.
Because, for example, if you were to say that the museum remains what it was before Duchamp's urinal, then we would have a problem. But the fact that the very space of the museum is also changed by the fact that it allows for ready-mades.
Exactly.
Right? That shows that the ready-made actually goes into the composition of the museum as well. So it localizes the museum in the same sense that it relocalizes the object, right? So it's not simply two external things put together without affecting each other.
Yes, exactly. And we could say even that, something about the space itself that, something about the space itself or the transcendental itself has to kind of change at that moment. So they're kind of like, you can think of basic compositions which don't change the underlying transcendental, but you can also think of kind of these more radical combinations that and the whole point of the next few books is going to be understanding, like ranking these different changes, right, in terms of their potency. Okay, but we're getting ahead now. So here we have still in the review portion that the transcendental is something, it's a logical thing, right? But it also has a spatial side. So he says here, like, we think of truth values, and like in the minimal Boolean algebra, here is like maximum and minimum, but we can also think of it as true and false, all the way to very sophisticated topologies, right? And they all come equipped with these operations that allow us to formulate logic. And then, like we said last time, right, we have this notion of a sheaf, and the sheaf is going to allow us to make a consistent gluing of some parts of this space, right? The space itself is kind of the transcendental, but on top of the transcendental, we want to somehow glue a set together in some consistent way. So here we have, so in order to do that, we have to define, function of identity, and then identity is a mapping from the object, or rather the product of the object with itself to the transcendental, and it's going to give us all these operations, right? So we're going to have existence, which is the kind of reflexive case of identity, and then we're going to get localization, which we just talked about, and then that's going to give us compatibility and so on, right? So I definitely want to have a better grasp of localization here, because it's going to be a crucial part of the relation definition later on. And then, yes, then now we're entering the new stuff, which is between any two objects, which we've already glued them together at this point, according to the transcendental world. There can exist relations, and they have to conserve these things, right? And conserve the intensities of existence and localizations. So these two operations, when they work for one object and they work for another object, the mapping between them cannot change how these properties work.
So
right,
to go back
again,
to your example, it's like saying, well, the urinal has an intrinsic relation to the museum, but me walking into the museum and coming out doesn't change the relation between the urinal and the museum. Let's say it works on top of that, right? So that's a good distinction between, let's say, this intrinsic relations, which we call, let's say, object relations, right? Mm-hmm. And this sort of frequentation or kind of transit on top of this already established structure, right? We want to be able to say there is such a thing as an object like ready-made, go into the museum and this changes the object, but we want to be able to rigorously distinguish this from the fact that when I walk into the museum and I leave, I don't change.
Exactly. Yeah, because you don't want to have a situation where everything that enters the museum somehow fundamentally changes it, right? And you have this kind of like, we need boring basic Mariology.
Yeah, we need boring relations, not only
we need
cool relations.
Need boring relations. Yeah, sometimes two things they bypass each other and there's no effect. It's like nothing happens, and that's actually the majority of encounters, right, between two objects. They don't know what, like Lacan uses that image of like the fish and there's like a fish and an apple or something, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so two things that have no concept of each other, they don't exist in the same world. Then, we should be able to identify those types of relations.
Well, they can exist in the same world, but just because they are, let's say, within the same transcendental, that doesn't mean that every transformation will affect their composition or their structure, right? So we need, let's say, structure ring relations, which are the atomic logic and the object logic, right? And we need, let's say, structured relations that kind of transit within that structure, but don't have the power to affect it, right? So you want to be able to distinguish those things and not simply distinguish them by talking about chance and contingency. You want to be able to structurally distinguish between the urinal walking into the gallery and you walking into the gallery. The urinal changes itself in the gallery. You don't change neither of the two, right? So how is that distinct, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're after here. Okay, yes. And then we have the final part, which is The multiples of the situation are retroactively structured by their objectivation, right? This is the transcendental sheaf thing. And then there's this real synthesis, right? Which we kind of covered, but we could always go back to that. This idea of the territories, and then the projection, the coherent projection, everything like that. How it basically the set is glued together, right? Okay, so this 1 through 6 is the greater logic. It is the analytic portion. It's how Badiou looks at appearances and gives us the tools to kind of dive in and see how they work, see their internals. Which again, the internals can be, it's not necessarily like inside of something. It can also be just a more general sense of relations between things. So yeah, the intrinsic and extrinsic or structured and structuring relations, that distinction is always important at this point. It's ever present because, I would say these first 4 would be intrinsic. Mm-hmm. Actually, even this one, right? So 1 through 4 and 6 have been intrinsic. So this is now the only time that he's talking about this kind of other type of relation. Okay, so I kind of came up with some formal tools to give us a better sense of what the relation is actually doing. So given a transcendental with these 3 values, so the minimum, the maximum, and then also this half measure here, and the partial order relation, and given a multiple that only has 3 elements, we can create a space of identities, which is just the mapping, exactly the mapping of A times A to T. So this is a kind of a visual representation of that, right? Based on, in the previous presentation, the notion of relations as being a map or a morphism that can be represented as a table, right? Mm-hmm. So notice that the existences are distributed along the diagonal here. So the existence of A is maximal, the existence of B is half, and C is the inexistent, right? And we know that there's a rule that says the identity of 2 things cannot be greater than the lesser of their existences. So for example, the identity of A and B cannot be greater than 1/2 because B is, the existence of B is 1/2. Right, so this obeys that rule. Also, I wrote here, verify that this is closed under localization. So if you think about it for a second, the rows here correspond to atoms, right? Because in some sense, if we look at just a single row, we're fixing one of the parameters of the identity map, right? Because identity map takes 2 parameters normally. That's why you have this grid. But if we look at only one row, we're actually saying, okay, let's only consider the identities which start with A, let's say. And this is exactly what the atoms are, right? So in some sense, this row gives us a function that then we can evaluate on the various other elements. Mm-hmm. So here, this grid gives us 3 atoms. And so when I say verify that this is closed under localization, I mean, can we localize any 2 of these? Can we localize any atom here with another existence of another atom to produce something that's not in this grid? If we can produce something new that's not in this grid, then this is not a closed set, right? So let's try that. So let's say we want to localize any of these on 0. Well, if we localize A on 0, we get C, because localizing means we're kind of limiting the upper bound, let's say, of the valuations that the atom can give us, right? So the localization of A on 0 is C. Same for B. And then let's say localize B and C on 1/2. Well, that for B, it's going to leave it unchanged because the existence of B is 1/2. So if you localize something on its own existence, it doesn't change it. Similarly, if you localize C on 1/2, that doesn't change it because the existence is already greater. Sorry, the existence of C is lesser than the thing you're localizing on. Okay, so this kind of shows you, and of course, if you localize A on 1/2, you get B, because this 1 becomes, it's like it becomes tuned downward to 1/2. So B is like A in the register of 1/2, or you can think of it as like tuned down to 1/2. And finally, if you localize anything on 1, which is the maximum, you just get the same atom again. So that trivially will hold for all 3. So that means that we've proven this is closed under localization. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, this is a valid object of a world. Okay. But we also, before we even talked about atoms, Badiou introduced the notion of predicates in a world. So it's useful to think, okay, what is the difference between an atom and a predicate? Well, atoms, as you can see here, can only have one element that belongs to it maximally. And then here's the tricky part, because belonging to it maximally can vary depending on the existence of this element. So the way I read it is that at most one element can have a maximal degree, right? So even though B doesn't have a maximal degree, it doesn't have a maximal existence, it's still an atom because it doesn't violate the rule that only one thing can be maximal.
It's at most 1 at maximal, right?
Yes, at most 1 is maximal. So this is still a valid atom. What's not a valid atom would be something like pi1 here. Pi1 has 3 elements that are all maximal, right? So yeah, so that would be the formal distinction. So if the world here, if the transcendental has the same values of 0, 1/2, and 1, that's three distinct values. We can calculate the number of predicates in the world as being the number of...
I would say the number of different predicate structures, right? Because you can actually have an infinity of predicates that fall under pi1.
Exactly. Yeah, this is an equivalence class of predicates. Yeah. Right. So yeah, let's, we can use the examples that we already encountered, like the anarchists, right? These would be, pi1 would be like, dresses in black, is really loud, and, runs a bookstore or something like that.
Runs a bookstore.
So yeah, this would be a maximal anarchist.
Dressed in black, runs a bookstore, and is really loud.
I know that guy.
Yeah, so yeah, it gives us a kind of a combinatoric view of predicates. But the interesting thing here is also that the same thing we saw here also applies here, right? There is actually a predicate that looks exactly like A, 1, 1/2, 0. That's pi6. So this gives us a nice view of how the atoms embed themselves into the space of predicates. Right? There's 27 possible predicates, but only some of these are atoms.
Yeah, I would say like only some of these can cover the world in an atomic fashion, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, and this kind of also gives us the idea, another notion of the notion of space, which comes with a notion of covering and, by extension, a notion of refinement of covers. So recall that last time we talked about covers as being like morphisms that target elements of space. So like this is a cover. If this was a morphism and it hit the space and it covered these three elements, this is a valid cover, right? I mean, the codomain or the image of the morphism is the entire space. But we can also think about other covers, like the one that covers these two, and so two morphisms, one that covers this one and then one that covers this one. Let me use a different color, right? So in that sense, this one plus this one is a cover. The red one is also a cover, right? And then, so the refinement of a cover means can each of the covers here embed in this one? If so, it's a refinement. So we know that this green and this orange one, they are actually included in this one. So this is a refinement of, right, refines, let's see, refines this, right? And then we can ask, what is the upper bound, or what is the greatest amount of refinement? Or you can conversely say, like, what is the lower bound of the space? Well, it would be this refinement, right?
Mm-hmm.
This plus this plus this, right? In the same way that these two embed themselves in this larger cover, this one embeds into these two. So the system of covers on a space give us a partially ordered set, just like, because there, like there can be some equivalent ones, right? I could have chosen these two, and then the green one could have been here, right? And that would be equivalent to this one. So this one has, like, multiple variations here. Right, so this system of covers is important to understand. So we can see that exactly with the predicates, right? Predicates are like covers of the space, and the atoms are the lower bound, or the most refined version of the covers. Okay. So here's some questions to think about. Given the space of identities, identify the atomic predicates. Well, we've already done that because we know the rows. Oh, sorry, yeah, the rows here are the atoms, and then we can find exactly those rows here. But also, if we want to think what are all possible atoms, not only the ones I've shown here, but any possible atom here, we just have to exclude the ones that have more than one, right? Exclude the predicates that have multiple maximum valuations. So pi of 5 would be a valid candidate for an atom. Pi of 6 is valid. Pi of 7 is not valid, right? Because it has 2 1s here, and so on, right? So that's how you would solve this one. Then you can construct a poset from the space of possible predicates. Well, that's exactly this type of thing. but it doesn't look exactly like this, right? Because this picture is still Boolean or classical in its covering. Like you either cover it or you don't. Whereas in the case of the transcendental here, you have this concept of a half covering. So a morphism can kind of, it's like fuzzy, right? It's a fuzzy covering. So then
a fish net that captures half a fish.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't it's not, did you catch the fish or did you not catch the fish? It's, you know, did you maybe catch a fish? Something like that.
Or just a part of it, like the tail.
The tail of the fish only, yeah. So yeah, that actually makes the post set of the space of possible predicates, it makes it a lot more complicated, but it still has these elements, right? 27 elements arranged in a partial order. Right, and just to show you, like pi of 2 must be less than pi of 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, you think about it, pi of 1 is the best net. It catches all the fish. Pi of 2 catches 2 of the fish and half of the third one. So pi of 2 is not as good as pi of 1. So you have this ordering relation. Pi of 27 is the worst net, which is the whole. And then, then we can find the order relation on A. So smallest and largest subsets of the post set from step 2 that satisfy the axioms. Okay, so I showed that this set of 3, these are closed under localization. And that is actually a very strong condition because we can't just pick any set of atoms and any set of predicates in this space to be our space, right? We have to pick those that are closed under this operation. So if I were to pick, let's say, if I were to pick pi of 13 and I say, okay, this is an atom in my space. Well, because I picked this one and I know that I can localize this on 1/2, pi of 14 must be in my space too. So I can't pick a predicate and not pick another predicate that could be what's it called? The result of a localization. Mm-hmm. On the one I pick. So if I pick this one, I have to pick this one. So that's
like
kind of
if you pick the definition of anarchist that has 5 sub conditions, you also pick the one that has 4.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So the quality of the predicates I pick, it determines kind of this what kind of structure my space has. Obviously, like I could just pick all 27 of these predicates. Then I would have like a maximally structured space. It would have all possible predicates, and by definition, it would be closed under localization, right? Because localization can only give you something from this list. Okay, so that kind of is how you would think about these 3 problems. So now that we have a very strong idea of what objects are in their valuations and the space of valuations, we can now think about this notion of relations. So he gives in the history of Quebec, or the kind of the world of Quebec, this notion of intrinsic determinations and network of relations, right? Which correspond to what we've been talking about as structured and structuring relations, right? So we have intrinsic determinations like the French language, what the people of Quebec speak, Quebecois, right? French, and then territorial unity, population statistics, the geography, and infinity of other predicates. So there's all of these things that you can use to characterize the world of this world. Okay, But then you also have networks of relations, so relations between objects in this world. So Anglophone concentration of powers versus the Francophone mass, which is largely proletarian, right? So you have like class relations, neo-colonial relations, and you have, and this is reflected in the names that of cities, right? So you have these networks of relations that kind of unfold in time, right? We talked about temporality before. You in this notion of like the history of a city, you have all of that kind of unfolding character of relations. So he says here, the constitutive relations or operations of the theory of the pure multiple, sorry, the constitutive relations or operations of the theory of the pure multiple. So that's like, that's these intrinsic determinations. And then you have their exposure, which we're about to get to, right? This idea of a relation being globally visible, let's say. And then, so these are kind of the properties of relations, right? A relation can be globally exposed, and relations can be, just between two beings, between two objects, let's say. Okay, so actually this doesn't really give us much besides globally exposed, which we'll see later is like a universal relation. But here we should recall kind of the properties that I introduced last time with regard to morphisms like injectivity, surjectivity, factoring morphisms, like all that stuff is kind of in the background here. Okay, so for the formal definition, Badiou gives us these two conditions, right? The existence, so first, a relation between two objects, which are these. We know these things as being a multiple and a identity. And a relation is a function or morphism between the first to the second that satisfies these two things, right? The existence of the relation of A, so A mapped to B, right, is equal to the original existence. So you think of the existence on the right here needs to be the same as existence on the left for every element. And then localization must be preserved. So so in other words, it doesn't matter what order you do these operations. You can localize first A on P, and then take that element to B, or you can take A to B and then localize on P. Either way, you have a commutativity there, right? Right, so we can actually write that down. So like,
but is it localization of A on P or A on B?
I think P. P being just some degree.
Ah, okay, sorry.
Yeah. So if we have A to B, where A belongs to A, B belongs to B, right? So yeah, it's actually what we should do is say we can have this, but then A localized on P, still in A, right? And then P of A. So actually P is the relate this, I mean in this relation rho. So let's do this. right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have this commutativity, right? Yeah. So I can either go A to B first and then localize, or I can go A localize first and then so let me, maybe this, I don't know if this makes it messy, but the arrows going from left to right are the relation.
Mm-hmm.
The arrows going down is localization. So this rule is basically saying that yeah, these two paths are the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, and then from these two, he gives us two propositions.
Are you saying something, Karam? No, I thought you were asking something. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. So yeah, he deduces two things here, which is that, okay, if this is true, if the above is true, then we can show that the identities of two elements in A must be less than their mapped identities in B, less than or equal to. So in other words, you can increase identity in the process of mapping. So the relation can increase your identity. So things can get closer together, let's say, or more similar, but they cannot get less similar. They cannot become more different when you have this relation. Also, it must conserve compatibility, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that the most counterintuitive, I mean, if you remove the whole problem of, and once the problem of, you know, intrinsic and extrinsic relations is settled, and the idea that, well, to use our example, right, the urinal can be changed by going to the museum, while there are relations of, for example, me going into the museum that don't affect the same change either to myself or to the museum. So it's a relation that might, for example, make me more similar to the other people inside the museum, but it cannot affect the change either in the museum or myself, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's, once that's settled, the second weird thing about his definition of relation, perhaps, is that it's an oriented one, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think it's easier to assume in this kind of more vague idea of relations that a relation is not oriented. Like for something to, for example, for A to be mapped onto B, it should imply the inverse, but it doesn't, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that is an interesting thing, which might cause some confusion, I think, especially when we go to this notion of universality, or this what he calls the exponent, because yeah, in some sense, for any two objects, there's at least two relations, right? There's a relation from A to B, but there's also a relation from B to A, and they don't have to coincide.
Yeah. I think that he divides this problem, like he divides it by saying that, well, the thing that is, let's say, the same both ways is actually coming from the atomic logic, which is the conservation of existence and compatibility and so on. That's actually guaranteed by the intrinsic relations, right, that constitute this logical state. It's not by the, let's say, structured relation that comes afterwards or on top of this. That can be oriented, and that can have, let's say, two different values. So A can be localized on B, can be related to B in a way that B is not related to A. But that kind of, you can conceptually confuse this with saying that they are mutually related, because at the intrinsic level, some properties are conserved nonetheless, right? Mm. So I think that that's also a power of, when you distinguish structuring relations from structured relations, you're able to realize that there is some level of mutuality, let's say, constitutive relations that are mutual in some sense, but they concern localization, compatibility, and so on. Whereas these extrinsic relations, they're allowed to be oriented without you losing anything for it, because now that part is already settled. So you can talk about, you know, somebody who likes the other and the other doesn't like you back, and that doesn't need to be thought as a mutual thing and something like this. You can actually have this sort of orientation without losing the power to talk about mutual effect.
Yeah. Actually, brings up a thing which I wasn't understanding until just now. That when you say that these two levels, these two relations, these two types of relations, they actually exist simultaneously among these elements, right? So you have like urinal, right? And you have the museum. But this can be considered as one object, in which case these relations are they're specified by the identity, right? And not only this, but like all of the possible atoms. Right? I don't know how we would, you know, all possible intrinsic relations.
For example, we can to begin with, like say the parts of a urinal counted like they were distinct in a way. The mereology of a urinal is distinct from the mereology of Duchamp's urinal, because it's almost everything identified as one, right? The inside, the outside, with the exception of the signature, which is clearly a maximal thing. In that urinal, the predicates to understand the urinal in a museum are not the ones that distinguish the inside, the outside. Is it broken? Is it not? Can I use it? Is it vacant? Right? So you can see that something changes in the predicates that discern what's atomic about that object, right?
Yeah.
In a way that's similar to what it did for the museum, because up until that point, the idea that you could consider an object without discussing its parts was not part of the museum. The museum was a place to inspect the parts of paintings or objects, like a statue that has arms, heads, and things like this. Like you can see that it's coextensive in the history of art. The moment that objects became undecomposable, like they count as objects of art, but they are you cannot analyze them aesthetically by analyzing their parts. That makes no sense. That museums became that place is contemporary to the Duchamp's urinal entering the museum. So you can see that they actually affect each other.
Yeah. But then, exactly. The extrinsic ones sit on top, or somehow simultaneously. You can think about just normal relations as being, you know, just other objects around the room or around the space which don't have any kind of, right, but within the same transcendental as well.
Yeah.
They don't have any sort of structuring effect. Yeah. Okay, so let's think about it. Yeah, let's combine the formalism from previously with the T matrix thing, and think about it as a transformation. So I claim that this relation is valid in that it satisfies all of the definitions previously defined, right? So these two properties, right? So let's verify that. Well, to verify the first one, that the existences aren't changed, we just need to look at the diagonal, right? To see that existences were not modified. And then the second principle, that localizations, that's a little trickier to do, but we basically can localize. So first we localize on the left side, and then we transform, versus localizing or mapping from left to right and then localizing. Right. So for example, we said that, so actually I left this out because in order to maintain the one-to-one-ness of this, I actually, and also to prepare for a future example, I actually broke the rule that this is closed under localization. So for now, we can ignore this because it's actually very difficult to find two matrices that obey exactly all these rules. So I had to make a choice to show this. But let's just say that this is closed. Assume that this space is closed under localization, and I'm just not showing you the other atoms.
Okay.
Right? Well, yeah, the relation then allows us to map and then show that this still holds. Let me see if we can make that work here. So like A gets mapped to A, right? We know that identities can increase. They cannot decrease.
What's
So
P
that's
here?
P is the relation.
No, that's rho. That's the relation. What is P? The value upon which you localize.
Yeah, you can
okay.
choose a value, no?
Yeah, so you can choose up to 3 values, right? Oh, actually, no. In this case, we have an infinite number of values because T is all of the rational numbers between 0 and 1. Yeah, now I remember why I didn't make this closed under localization, because actually that would be an infinite number of entries, right? So this is a subtlety because depending on what you choose to be your values of T, you control how many possible atoms are in your space, right? Because, so for example, if I were to localize this on, let's say, 1/4, then this would become 1/4, this would become 1/4, and this would be 0.
Mm-hmm.
But I could choose another fraction, and this would make another atom. So because I can't write all of those, that's why I left.
But 1/4 was not in your original transcendental.
Yeah, that's why I wrote here, this is a different one.
Oh, I see.
Just to make the example work better.
Yeah, otherwise things would just shift to values we already knew, not acquire new values. Like either something 1 would become a half or half become 1, but you would never
couldn't
get.
Couldn't you just use the same transcendental?
That's what I'm saying. Like if he used it, yeah. Yeah. So if I use the same transcendental, then I would have something like this, right? 1, 1/2, 0. So if I were to map this, let's say just this row, I need to map it somewhere. Well, the only thing I can really do is, actually I can't do anything because let's say I turn 1/2 to 1. Well, this is no longer an atom because we said atoms must have at most one maximal element. So I can't turn 1/2 to 1. I can't turn 1/2 to 0 because we said that identities cannot decrease. They can only increase. So I can't change B. I can't change A because, sorry, the identity of A on A, because we said existences can't change, right? So I could change C.
Sorry, another question.
Mm-hmm.
For me to understand, to catch up with this example. You have capital A and capital B. Capital A is the object and capital B is the object. Now, in this matrix that you have little a, b, c, are they elements of those objects or are they objects themselves?
They're elements.
They're elements of those objects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in this case, then A is on your left-hand side, the matrix on the left-hand side, and
mm-hmm.
B is the matrix on the right-hand side.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And this describes the identity relations between all of the elements of A and B. Yeah.
Okay.
Right? Because if there's 3 elements, there must be 9 relations on each.
Right. So then I don't understand the correspondence of matrix to sets, because if it is A, because a matrix on the left-hand side is A cross A, not A. And matrix on the right-hand side is B cross B. And the definition of relation is not A cross A goes to B cross B, it's A to B, A to B.
Ah, yes, it is A to B, but it has to conserve this stuff. And so because it has to conserve this stuff, this is like a way
No,
of
it has to only conserve E of A, which is the first, which is the row, the diagonal row. It just has to conserve that, conserve that, not the rest.
Yes, but it cannot lower any of these. So that was another. What did I? So it says that here, but oh yes, P8. So okay, this alpha, AB is the identity. So alpha is just the identity indexing function on A, right? And beta is the indexing function on B. So this P8 actually is another condition which Badiou derives from the original two conditions.
So which one are you? So I was after proving the first one.
Yeah. So the reason I need to show this n by n grid is because I need enough information to satisfy all four of these conditions. But yet you're right. If I only needed to satisfy the first condition here, then I wouldn't need this. I would just care about the diagonal.
The diagonal. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Okay. So in order to show, so the function row, the relation row is what is getting a value and doing what to it?
It is preserving existences and also preserving localizations. And it's also conserving identities. So identities can become stronger, but not weaker. So the identity between A and B is currently 1/2. It can become stronger, so it can become 3/4, but I could not make it, let's say, like 1/4.
No, but those are the properties. But what is the row itself? Like in terms of normal mathematical calculations, like multiplying by 1/2 or dividing by something.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that actually is the next slide, because Badiou doesn't give us what row is, right? But there is some mathematics out there to kind of fill this in, and I did some experiments with it to see if we can like pin it down using matrix multiplication. But unfortunately, it doesn't work exactly. So we can talk about that. But before we get to that, this part is clear though, right? That something is happening. We don't know what exactly, but something is happening, and the resulting matrix on the right has to
some
obey
constraints. Yeah,
has some constraints. You can't just pick any set of identities.
So this row is apparently correct, is satisfying the first condition, because the diagonal on the left is equal to diagonal on the right.
Yes.
So what's this? The second condition is the localization of the row of localization of A under a value from the transcendental.
P is from the transcendental, yeah.
Right. Is equal to the applying the relation on A and localize it on P. So in this case, my question was, what was P in that example?
Right, P, yeah, so in this case, P would be any value between 0 and 1, any rational. And because there's so many of them, you can't really show that, but you have to imagine localizing A on some value of P. You can choose any one you want, and that will produce an atom. And then think of the relation P taking that, the imaginary atom that you just created, take that to the one on the right and just assume that that's going to exist. Yeah.
And then my original question was, why are you taking P from that transcendental? Why not from like a finite set of transcendental.
Yeah, I wanted to actually, I retroactively made this example so that I could do this matrix thing.
Yes, so there are further things that you had a strategy.
I had a strategy. It didn't work completely. So if we can find a simpler example.
I'm just trying to catch up with your strategy.
Yeah. Yes. So.
And I think it's also a good strategy because we can get used to the idea, not only of, like, okay, 3 truth values, but to work with the, infinite amount of possible p's. I think it shows the size of what's at stake, right?
Yeah, it is really hard to come up with good examples. Even and consider that this is not even the full complexity because it's a totally ordered set. When you start introducing this like partial order lattice structure, this thing quickly becomes like just intractable. Like I don't think we could come up with an example that would be meaningful, or at least, I mean, maybe we can with a smaller lattice of like 4 elements or something. But yeah, it takes a lot of guess and check. Let's say there's no like method that I know of that we could come up with a good example here. Okay, so that this somehow satisfies these things, right? Oh yeah, the final thing is compatibility. So this kind of already follows from the localization, because compatibility is just like mutual localization. Okay, so then we get this example. So multiplying 2 matrices. In this case,
there was a quote at the end of the last slide. Dennis, what was that? I was trying to read it, something like about Leibniz or something.
Yes, this one. Yeah, in the world, there is no possible influence of one term on another. What happens instead is that, refer to the same world, the 2 terms agree with regard to their deployment because they are under the same law. And this is where he agrees with Leibniz. It's called harmony. Yeah. And for him, it's operations of the transcendental.
Yeah, so there's no relation in the sense of an object influencing directly another object. All their relationships result from the structure of the world itself. This
exactly.
is kind of the idea, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is, counterintuitive for a lot of reasons, but just thinking of common relations that we use, we think about like causality, for example.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah.
Like, how can you say that no influence? Like, doesn't make sense. But I would say, like, it goes back to this idea of if there is such a thing as a causal relation, it must be occurring at the level of an intrinsic determination, not this extrinsic relation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is also defensible in the sense of you have to have like a causal relation in the vocabulary of your world, so to speak.
Exactly.
So in a sense, the consistency of the world is making possible to have something that we encounter and call causal relations.
Exactly. Yeah. If you think about like a physical system, the way
exactly, like a physical framework of explanation, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's always described as this ideal situation. I mean, even if it's not ideal, but it has to have this extra structure on it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah. And this gives us a nice idea of how Badiou sees the term monad, right? Monad means you can find an object where what was previously considered to be an extrinsic relation can be converted to an intrinsic relation in a way. like a relation in which one thing does affect the other thing. Well, a monad is just the name for the absorbing of that relation into some bigger object, right? So in some sense, like the non-influential relations, they're like the leftover relations, the ones that don't need any further structure.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so yeah, this didn't work because of these reasons. So, I mean, this does work, actually. This example works, but it doesn't work in general. So the way you would do this matrix multiplication is you would choose, so this, it's encapsulated in this formula where you are iterating through the second term. So this is the row and this is the column. So in that sense, you are taking the conjunction of this term and this term, and then you're taking the conjunction of this term and this term. So 1/2 and 3/4, and then 0 and 0. So, okay, we can do one of these, right? So 1 conjoined with 1 is 1. 1/2 conjoined with 3/4 is 1/2, right? Because conjunction gives us the lesser of the two. And then 0 conjoined with 0 is 0. Then we take the envelope of those three values that we produced. So 1, 1/2, and 0. And the conjunction, the envelope of that is 1. And that goes in this element here, the top left. Right, that's how to do one of these. So if you wanted to do like this middle term, you would do the middle row of the left and the middle column on the right, and you would do the same process of doing the conjunction pointwise, and then doing the envelope of all of the resulting things, and then that would give you the middle term. Okay, so this works, but the problem is, first of all, it's like an easier example because we're using a totally ordered thing, but also conjunction becomes min when you have a totally ordered set, right? Min meaning it always takes the lower of the two values, but this isn't true in a partially ordered set in general, right? Minimum only happens because all of these values lie on the same chain. So that's node 1. Node 2 is that, there can be more than one matrix representation for row. Specifically, this 0 value could have been something else. I just chose 0 because it worked, but I could have chosen a different thing that also worked. And if you did the calculation for this 1/5 example, you'll find out that actually it could be any value from 0 to 1/5. And this whole calculation would still work. So that's also a problem because we don't have a unique representation of the matrix. The third problem is that this matrix on the right is not closed anymore. So if let's say we come up with a matrix that multiplies here, you might get something that's no longer closed. But then we can fix that by introducing a closure operator, which will add the atoms that you need, right? Closure just means no matter what, I can find an atom that is that fits the localization that I'm looking for. So we need some other kind of operator to make the one on the right consistent again. Node 4, 0 entries are very hard to deal with because conjunction, so because envelope, this envelope at the end always takes the largest value. So in order for me to get a 0 in my result, I would have to make an entire row 0 or entire column 0. Okay, yeah, you'd have to work an example out to see this is true, that I can never have a resulting matrix have a 0 entry without having huge complications there. So because of these 4 reasons, this is not a good tool to use. However, we could speculatively improve this formalism if we had a notion of a metric space. So the problem is that it lies in the definition of identity, right? Identities and conjunctions, they are not, they don't give us the right kind of structure to talk about matrices in this sense, because we don't have like additive relations, right? This operator doesn't exist. Like we can't add 2 distances or 2 degrees of values together. We can take their conjunction, but conjunction doesn't have the right structure we need. So the proposal here is just that if we could find a map that could take some set E to the transcendental such that it obeyed these 3 rules, which are the rules for a metric space, then I'm saying we could come up with a formalism for relations that obeys like matrix multiplication. Okay, so this is kind of like a technical point that doesn't change how we should read Badiou, but I think it was it's an interesting exercise to see, like, because we've been talking about extracting metrics from T. So this is how you would kind of do that. And apparently I was looking around and there is something called a dual integral thing, quantile, which I don't understand at all, but apparently some people are working on this. And it's, like within the last 5 years, people have been trying to come up with a metric on Heyting algebras. So if they can do that, then we can have something like this.
If I'm not mistaken, that book on frames and locales has a long, let me just find it here, just 1 second. I think it's this one. It's called Frame and Locales by that Jorge Picado guy. It has a whole chapter on metric frames.
Okay.
I'll just see if I'll open here, see if it's connected, but sorry.
Yeah, no, I have that. Yeah, I haven't looked at that. Yeah, that's a good place to look then, yeah. If we can figure out how to basically define a metric on the frame. And yeah, I'm not sure yet if it's possible for any frame, right? Because a Heyting algebra is a kind of frame. So the question is, yeah, can we do this metricization on any lattice or any frame?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then that would be a general procedure for extracting metrics out of transcendentals. Right, and in that example I gave from the very first meeting also is the one where just intuitively, the one where like every atom has a distance from its like its neighbors, let's say. And then localization means like that I would basically convert this web into into an atom of another kind, right? So these would be distances, some kind of distance metric.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is converting this structure the lattice structure, we can convert it into some kind of space structure like this. That's kind of what this is. This would do for us. Okay, so now we go back to the regular part of the book, which is the definitions of. Badiou introduces these three things when he talks about the inaccessible cardinal. He says that there's a certain infinite, the inaccessible infinite, which results neither from dissemination nor from totalization of parts of a lesser quantity. And then none of the operations of set theory basically can attain or construct the degree of infinity of this world. So the best way to think about that is this step 3 here, totalization. No matter how many times you take the power set of something in an inaccessible cardinal, no matter how many times you take the power set, you will still be within the world.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that's the conclusion here, right? If A belongs to M, the world, the power set of A belongs to the world. Yeah, and then these are the steps he takes. There he has this idea of dissemination, which means like if X is part of a union of multiple things, then it must be part of one of those things, right? And oh yeah, it must also have this. It must have something inside of it. Sorry, X. If X belongs to a combination of A's, then it must also belong to something that is inside of A. And then yeah, transitivity means if I'm part of A and A is part of the world, then I'm part of the world, right? Actually, yeah, the second one, Gabriel, you were talking about transitivity exactly in this way, right? In the Karatani meeting.
Yeah.
Of like, how do I see the global world? Well, I know if I'm part of the world, so if I'm part of something that is in the world, then I must be part of the world, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of local to global meaning here.
I think that this is really important because up until now, I mean, this is actually, let's say, giving a bit more of meat to what he talks about in the first chapter of the Transcendental, with this idea of local consistency and things like this. It already implied, in some sense, some of the stuff we're seeing. But I would say that the positive, let's say, or the affirmative or the constructive part of the chapter on relations concerns first of all, this issue, right? That the idea that a world, I mean, we talked about objects and we saw a lot of properties of how he defines objects, and very rich. When we get to this chapter, on the one hand, we get this theory of structured relations that are very weak or conservative. And we get this, let's say, the first let's say, properties about the world itself and not about the stuff in the world. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So inaccessibility is actually, let's say, a consequence of working through dissemination, transitivity, and totalization. Right. The idea that a world is a space with properties such that, you know, whatever it is that you have, the parts of the thing you have are also in the world. That if certain property is applied to a set, in a certain sense, it's valid for parts of that set, right? So if A is in the world, what is in A is also in the world. And also that this kind of lower bounds that he removed, right? There is no lower bound because the component of everything that is in the world is also in the world. There's also no upper bound, right? You're not gonna, let's say, leave the world by totalizing what's in the world into a bigger whole than the world itself, right? So these are two properties about, let's say, the reaches of a world, right? A world is defined in such a way that you cannot leave it, right? Either by going down or up, which I think is very important because we were interested in the chapter on the object, about this idea of localization, atomic components, and the resolution. What's the right resolution for our predicates so that they capture something relevant about the world, right? We made use of that example many times that except for, let's say, in the world of, I don't know, veterinarians or doctors, talking about perhaps the cells of the cat is less, let's say, adequate to the existence of the cat in a house than talking about the cat having 4 paws, walking around, having a tail, and things like this. So that mereological distinction between the components in terms of paws, fur, tail, let's say, captures the constraints of the world of the cat better than if you were to talk about the cells of the cat, the cancerogenous cells, the healthy cells, distinguish between them, how they're localized in the body, the tissue, and so on, right? But that could give you the idea that you found the lower bound. Well, if they're more adequate atomic predicates than others, right? If the passing of constraints in the world of the cat walking about are better defined by these big parts of the cat than by the small ones that in fact almost play no efficacious role, direct efficacious role. There's nothing gonna happen in your house that the answer to it is the particular cell in the paw of my cat, right? That doesn't mean, and I think that's what the chapter kind of adds, that doesn't mean that this sort of dissemination of the components, right, it presents an ontological limit to the world. So it doesn't mean that you get to say, oh, but the cells of the cat are not part of the world of the cat in your house. So you kind of distinguish the idea of this resolution or the proper coverings from the idea of a sort of lower bound, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
I think that's very important because otherwise you could get the idea that, well, if I can refine the cover to a point that I'm no longer in the world, but that's not the case. It's the efficacy that changes, right? So it's if you capture the causal model or not of the world. So, I mean, I'm very much into the Eric Howell thing, right? So there is this whole study, whole interesting study on how the proper scale for analyzing a system concerns, let's say, the greatest information of causal power of that system. And it can be a coarse-grained scale rather than a lower-grained one, or detailed-grained one, right? But it doesn't mean that the particles of the cat are not in the world that the cat is in, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if this drawing does anything, but
I like it though.
Yeah, this idea that like you're only looking at a slice of the world, and in that slice, there can be limits to the granularity, but that doesn't mean that the world doesn't have more to it. It's just that the granularity of your transcendental is only looking at a certain slice of it.
Yeah, it's gonna map all those stuff to the same value, for example. But it doesn't mean that you found, let's say, you cannot zoom in out of the world, right? You zoom in so much into the cat that you left the world of the cat. So there's no outside in that sense, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it also means that
Dennis,
if you
question. Last time you defined subset and belonging, inclusion and belonging category theory by saying that an object in a category is a subset of another object if there is an arrow from the first object to the second, right?
Yeah, that's injective, right? Or sorry, monomorphism.
Yeah. And
that's a subset.
That's a subset. And element is when there is an arrow from the terminal object to another object.
Yeah. Exactly.
So wouldn't that be much easier? And obviously, all those arrows and all the objects with those arrows belong to the category. Wouldn't that be much easier to speak at that level as opposed to set theoretical level, which is a very non-intuitive way in order to describe dissemination and totalization?
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, but I mean, there is a good reason why he's using set theoretical terms, because he wants to talk about the ontological quality of the world, meaning the cardinality of this dissemination of totalization, because that's a definition of inaccessibility, right? That, for example, Aleph 1, Aleph 0 is inaccessible from finite operations on the finite, because there's nothing you can do like unions and conjunctions with finite numbers that will give you that infinite number, right? It's one of the negative ways to arrive at infinity, to claim that something is beyond the exhaustion of some operator, right? That's why you need to axiomatically affirm it.
Yeah,
but so it's very cogent to set theory to talk about it.
Yeah, it is cogent to set theory, and that's the original context. But there's obviously like a lot of work done since then to transfer that language into category theory. So, I mean, yeah, the question is whether one language is more suited than another. I think it would require more understanding from us, like, because the thing.
I mean, what I was trying to say is dissemination and totalization is readily available as a very rudimentary property of category theory. I mean, a category, by the way that subset and an element are defined.
I see. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, transitivity kind of corresponds to the composition of morphisms, right? Because if there's a morphism from A to M, the terminal. So yeah, the question is M. What is M here? Because M would be the terminal object. So then A would be an object going. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there should be some way to turn this into a.
I mean, I think the important thing. I mean, the way that I understood the relation of the discussion of closure and the discussion of relation is that what eventually we want to say is that if a world is composed of certain set of objects, there is no relation that we can draw between these objects that take us beyond the boundaries of the world.
I think it's not only relations, there's no composition of objects, like, because there's an object and it has its components. Now you get all the connections between the components and you call that another object.
Yeah, that's a better way to say it. No composition of objects that can take us beyond. But so the way that I'm curious about this, wouldn't that be much easier to say in the category language? That there is no composition within a certain set of objects such that those compositions do not belong to the category itself.
Yeah, but that's a negative statement. Like, you cannot get out. But there is, I mean, I'm sure there is a different categorical version of this, but it's very cogent with Badiou's ontology, which is all about set theory anyway, to say that there is a positive property of multiples which cannot be accessed through dissemination and totalization, which is a property of an inaccessible cardinality of that multiple. So it's a positive statement.
That is true. So, I mean, going with the way that Badiou has divvied up this space to ontological and logical, then if he wants to say that the statement about the closure of the world is an ontological statement, not a logical statement, then for sure he has to show it in set theory.
Yeah, and he does exactly that. He says ontological.
And he does exactly that. Yeah.
Ontological closure, logical completeness.
Right. But what I'm saying is that he could have, using category theory, he could have showed that this is a logical property as well.
Yeah, so that would be part of this idea of like translating everything to category theory without remainder. So like you would no longer need the ladder, let's say, of sets. But I think this goes back to our discussion that I've been thinking about, like who is Badiou writing for? Because I realize it's not only that he's not writing for us, like these nerdy guys, yeah, these nerds who are trying to like exhaust the technical foundations of his system, but he's also not writing for anybody, right? Because he himself says in one of his I think like Manifesto Philosophy or something that philosophy's address is nobody, right? So I think these debates on what language is the most appropriate, they kind of suppose an audience, right? People who know and love category theory, it's going to be easier for them if Badiou presented everything in category theory.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to understand his motivation. I get his what do you call it? His
stylistic.
Yeah, the division he's making in terms of ontology and logic. Yes, so I get that division that he wants to basically propose that words have operational closure as an ontological property, and then
it's not that the ontological property is not the operational closure. The ontological property is that the cardinality of the multiple they are is inaccessible. Which is
the same thing, no? I mean, there is no set theoretical operations that can allow those operations to get to the size of, or go beyond, or even reach the size of. Yeah.
Sure.
So, but other than this kind of division that he introduces, I don't find this. I find it a little bit arbitrary. That's what I'm trying to say. I mean, the way that he presents this argument I think, in my view, you could say equally that there is no operation, or there is no composition. Definitely composition, the language of composition is a logical language because you're talking about relation of objects. Any composition that happens between objects in a world belongs to that world, which is exactly the same thing as category theory says, that any arrow between objects that exist, any composition of arrows that between objects that exist in a world belongs to the same category. So,
but the question is whether one is more natural to express this property than another, and it seems hard to suggest that one is more natural.
I agree, and that's why I feel there is a little bit of arbitrariness.
I disagree totally, because the guy just finished a third big book that is all about large cardinal theory, where different types of infinity, inaccessible infinity, undivisible infinity, really large infinity. I mean, and the natural language of large cardinal theory is set theory. Like, that's how people discuss it. Like, and he wrote a previous book which is all about set theory as well. Like, so he should, in the second book, change everything. Why? I mean, the natural path is to say, when you discuss the logic, we put the categorical glasses on. But we already established that the extensional questions concerning the multiples themselves, which are purely extensional relations we are interested in, the natural language to talk about the size of extensions and so on, not only remains a set theory with this smaller, more trivial stuff, but is both being pursued today in terms of set theory when it comes to, okay, but what are the further properties of inaccessible cardinals? What is beyond inaccessibility? Like, those are questions being asked in that language. And I think that he gives you enough to make the translation, because when he defines dissemination, totalization, he goes into the idea of composition and so on. It's cogent. I think it's not like a break and then something new appears. And
I do find that it's a break, because in the previous chapter, we are completely immersed in the language of objects and atoms, and then we switch to in relation, which is part of the greater logic. So we are still in logic. Now all of a sudden we are talking about ontological properties of world. So I do see that as a break. Now I cannot comment about his third book, and this is not a critique that I'm trying to make to Badiou. I want to examine his reason for changing. So I guess my observation is two things. You mentioned that there is no break. I kind of see that this book is more about ontology than logic, yet being part of the greater logic. So I guess that's part of one thing that I'm trying to understand, the flow. And the second thing is, I do see this closure equally as a logical operation than just an ontological operation. And that kind of makes sense to me as well. So I'm still trying to understand his motivation for this change of tone to discuss that.
Yeah, so in any kind of categorical exposition, when you start talking about, it's very common to talk about the sets that underlie a category, right? Remember last time I was talking about the Halm functor, which takes between two objects of any category, it maps it to the set of arrows between them. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, so this kind of jumping back and forth between categories and sets, that's actually internal to category theory, but it only shows up when you start talking about what kind of properties your category has with respect to size issues. So you can say that there are locally small categories, or there are large categories, right? And the same thing with when we talk about Grothendieck toposes and stuff. There's Grothendieck universes, right? Which is certain condition for categories, for some categories. So I guess it's hard for me to say right now, but it seems like this jumping back and forth is not it's kind of in the categorical vein if you look at some literature.
I also think that, I mean, this is very, very closely related to what is, let's say, the big novelty about this book, which is to extend the analysis from being an event to a certain logical variability, which can, let's say, capture multiples to the point that we can make further differentiation and talk about how these multiples can be differentiated even further, right? And so the connection between the extensive analysis, the sort of multiple topological approach to set subsets and so on, and the logical, it's the connection between the two that is so interesting. It was never purely about category theory because he selected a very specific area of category theory where this relation between the extensional and the logical is very closely knit, right? So in every chapter we've seen thus far, set theory had a role to play, and he pinpointed it, I think. Perhaps the transcendental was it wasn't so clearly, though he begins with an argument about the set of all sets, right? In the atomic logic, this was clear on his restriction on what sort of atomic logics he's accepting, which he called the real atoms and the postulate of materialism and so on. And then in the transcendental functor, again, it was all about the relation between transcendentals and multiple, right? So it's always about the fact that inspecting multiples can give you, inspecting the existence of a multiple in a world can give you insight into a logical space and vice versa. Like that transit is the crucial part, I think. So it doesn't seem weird that at some point, the emphasis would go on one side or the other. I just think that it is pretty natural to talk about size set theoretically, not only due to his trajectory, but to the fact that that's a very natural way in mathematics to talk about those things. Like we have a lot of resources, right?
I agree, and I think there's a further kind of philosophical reason maybe behind it all, which is the Deleuze problem. Like,
yeah, that's true.
If we define relations like category theoretical way, you get very close to a kind of ontology that take relations to be primitive, and objects or their results as derivative from the relation. So
yeah, this would be the Yoneda perspective in a way.
Yeah. So I guess that his attachment yet to the language of set theory is a form of, attachment to the what's the name, axiom of materialism, or what was it?
Proposition
of materialism. What?
The postulate of materialism.
Postulate of materialism in some sense, which is something that I think he's very attached to because it differentiates his, so to speak, ontological commitments from those of part of the French milieu, the French intellectual milieu, in a sense. So I think this is justified from the point of view of the internal systematics of Badiou's own ontological commitments and the postulate of materialism and all of that. So this is a point of view I'm offering. I'm not sure if it's cogent.
It makes sense to me. I think that's the Deleuze issue is important. I mean, I'm certain that choosing to talk about Leibniz and choosing to make to praise the weak aspects of his theory of relation, like he could have called them extrinsic relations, but he chose to call them relations. And he chose to call these intrinsic relations objects and not intrinsic relations. I think in part to show, let's say, that it's almost like there is a weakness missing in the Deleuzean ontology because it's an ontology that is way too condescending with relations. It gives too much power.
It's way too connected. Everything is connected to everything else. And,
Exactly. Yeah. So here, I think he wants to show that, well, it's praiseworthy to have a weak theory of relations and to give the strong relations another name, right?
Yep.
So I agree. I think that the debate with Deleuze is very kind of crucial to understand.
I think it makes sense in the sociology of the intellectual history of all of that, you know, because of Deleuze's influence and the problem, the ongoing polemics you have between Badiou and Deleuze and the Deleuze camp and all of that. So I think it makes sense. Of course, it is an external point of view that has some purchase upon the internal systematics of Badiou's project, but it is an external point of view that is a point of view that is comparing Badiou's insistence upon certain ways of doing with you know, the intellectual milieu and the influence and, you know, some power play going on between.
No, and also I think that there is a even longer debate. Like there is an even longer sociological debate, but that becomes proper an issue of the history of philosophy, because the cosmological question of does the world have a beginning and an end? What's the size of the world? Those are ontological questions about the world that were posed in those terms of ontology and size since the Greeks, right? So I think that there's also a way of answering the question in a way that is he makes that distinction. He says, well, with regards to worlds, there are two sides to the question. There's the ontological question of how many, what's the size? Is it finite or infinite, right? Like Kantian issue.
Like Kantian antinomy, exactly. Cosmological antinomy. Yeah, we were talking about this last week.
Yes, exactly, true. And I mean, it's obviously for Badiou's personal pleasure to simply end a Kantian question. Like, no, don't worry, man. I'll settle that. Don't worry. Leave it to me. And then there's the logical facet of the question, which is, you know, what are objects for one another, and what's the relation between intrinsic relations? So I think the chapter is well divided between those two sorts of questions you can ask of a world.
Dennis, what was that lemma? You said Eudalemma?
Yoneda lemma.
Yoneda lemma.
Yeah, but can you remind us of that lemma? I forget now.
Yeah, that's quite complex.
Yeah, just a real quick reminder. It just basically says that objects are summarized by the morphisms that go to that object.
Exactly. That is how I remember it. So I think this is an important issue for us, or at least like us geeks in your interpretation, because I understand these reasons, like UJP saying that he has prior commitments and he wants to go around certain pathways so his position is not mixed up with Deleuze. But I think fundamentally, choosing category theory, and even in the passage that Gabriel, you translated from his book, I kind of getting the vibe, both in terms of the underlying mathematics that he's opting, as well as the consequences that this underlying mathematics is pointing his philosophy, is basically eradicating the difference between logic and ontology. And I think it is very important for us to understand exactly how much his position would be sustainable as like a Chinese wall between ontology and logic, because
there is no Chinese wall in his theory.
This is an ontological question, and that is a logical question. I don't think that there is any. It is possible to say that when we are thinking ontologically, we are thinking about points. And when we are thinking logically, we are thinking about arrows. Because actually there are nothing but arrows. That's what I'm trying to say.
But what does that statement mean though? There are nothing but arrows. Where? Like in reality?
Like internal and external. Saying that internal relationship are objects that are understood as multiplicities, and external relations are relations among objects. I don't think this distinction is a distinction that can be sustainable if we are talking about pointless topology.
I have the impression that you're asking a larger, different question than the question about his choice to turn to set theory to talk about cardinality, because you seem very struck by the fact that everything he wrote in Being an Event could be rewritten in terms of categorical terms, right? So in that sense, there would be, let's say,
isn't that what the gist of what you translated from?
But I mean, I translated it because some people think that that's an issue, and he's the first. I try to show that he's the first to say, sure, I have no problem with calling the realm where I think ontology becomes thinkable a very restricted realm within a huge universe of categorical structures. If you reduce it to the category of stuff which just extensional relations, sure, that's how you get to the world of ontology. But it seems to me that you're supposing that points and arrows are stuff and not discourse. And the fact that you can say a lot of stuff with different discourses. You can say the same stuff with points, and you can say the same stuff with restriction on arrows, so that they only kind of spell out extensional relations. That this gives birth to two different universes, of being. And I think the point is that no, you can talk about the same stuff with different discourses, but that's ontology, that's not being. Ontology is a discourse of being, not being itself. Right? So yes, sometimes to talk about worlds, you need more resources. You need a stronger language. And ontology is a weaker language, and that's a good thing for him. So he wouldn't choose a stronger discourse that is not compatible with the weak discourse that he needs to talk about extensional stuff. But making that choice is not changing the commitments with regards to being in a world. I don't think that it has that bearing on being itself. It has a bearing on shit. So, there is a translation between discourses, and that's important. And is that translation consistent? That's a good question. But that question is the move from talking about points to talking about arrows, and then restricting the arrows so that they make intelligible a pointed space. Is that consistent? That's a good question, but it's different from the question of why not abandon set theory altogether and come up with a relational ontology? Set theory was already a relational ontology, the relation of belonging. Not only that.
Well, I think coming back to the example that you made, why not think about thinking ontology in terms of complete Heyting algebra as opposed to Boolean algebra? The reason that ontology is a Boolean algebra, because belonging is a binary operation, is approaching the problem, I feel, is approaching the problem in reverse order, because you're already making an assumption that ontology is a Boolean algebra. Why not think of ontology in terms of Heyting algebra, in terms of partially ordered sets?
Because he's not only committed to the largest logical space, he's also committed to generic procedures, because he thinks they are you need both. And set theory, the development of forcing.
That's what I'm trying to say. So
but it was never intrinsic to mathematics. It's always philosophical and due to engagement with other stuff.
So he's bringing to his discourse presuppositions that he is bringing from elsewhere. That's what I'm trying to say.
You wrote a book on this. Your book says exactly this. The guy began with politics, art, science, and then he said, can I find a framework that preserves these properties and doesn't speak about anything in particular?
Yes, but my book also says that you make your presuppositions explicit. And that's the way the axiomatic thinking works. So the way that the axiomatic framework, I mean, having axioms doesn't mean that you have ZFC. ZFC is just a set of axioms at the time that makes sense for a particular discourse, which is set theory. My question is exactly like that, okay, let's have a different set of axioms. And these different set of axioms leave us to a particular type of partially ordered sets that are not restricted to Boolean algebra, but to Heyting algebra, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's now talk about ontology in the space of Heyting algebra instead of Boolean algebra. So my question is that now, coming back, reading this book and reading the kind of stuff that you can do to Heyting algebra, I'm in love with Heyting algebra. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to criticize Badiou or his choices and stuff like that. What I'm trying to understand is, what is the rational reason for us to say ontology is bound to Boolean algebra? What is Badiou's reason?
It's because of the way that you can talk about generic, and the way that Boolean algebras are connected to forcing, and the way that the second part of the book is connected also to Boolean algebras. I mean,
well, okay.
Points,
so
decision.
I think there's a different reason as well. I'm having difficulty pinpointing it, but it seems to me that partial orders belong in the realm of appearances, in a sense, like because it belongs in the relational realm of in a certain way, like a partial ordering has like a criteria of magnitude, a criteria of intensity, or something going on that, in a sense, exceeds the realm of ontology as Badiou wants to define it. If you want to go to like not a pragmatic justification for choosing ZFC, but let us call it a substantial commitment reason for that, I think it would be because of an underlying commitment to atomism, in a sense. So because of the judgments that all there is are multiples of multiples. So I don't think you can have like a post set and not bring in something from the realm of phenomenology at the same time.
Well, I mean, power sets are post sets.
Yeah.
And the power sets are ontological.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but I think again that point I think is really important. That, I mean, this guy didn't do any of this because it follows, like he didn't look for the richest discourse at any point. He looked for the discourse that has specific properties, and those properties are defined by his commitment to other stuff outside of ontology. Right?
Yeah,
and it's not presuppositions. Sorry?
Yeah, but I have an answer to that. The post set, the power set is a post set that is exclusively determined extensionally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's extensional.
It's not determined by anything else. So it's still in the realm of points, as Reza is saying. So, and it is derived in a sense in the order of reasons from the presentation. So yeah. It's kind of different. It's different to have the post set at the basis as a primitive, because if you have this as a primitive, it seems you have already difference of intensity of some kind between the primitive elements of your ontology. So the Deleuze problem poses itself right away, in a sense, right?
I don't know. I have the impression that there is a really good reason why, for example, issues concerning infinity keep being discussed in set theoretical terms. Because set theory, axiomatic set theory, it has a commitment with one thing, which is crucial. It's not simply axioms that you can affirm new infinities, but which is the reasoning through the absurd. and the possibility of proving something by proving it's negative, right? So that's a very powerful tool for Badiou that plays an important role in many, many, many parts of his construction, especially the descriptions of the most pragmatic stuff. So
that is true. I mean, it's not just multiples that is important. The whole logic is important. Like excluded middle is for him is very, very important.
yeah, and I think that he doesn't
generic
want
procedure.
This is something that I think sometimes falls between the cracks of the discussion that I think is very crucial. I think I had this talk with Caron once, but I think that it's very important to remember this. Like ontology, like whatever fits ontology must do three things. Like there are three types of conditions for an ontology. There's the stuff that it needs to be able not to do. So it needs to positively be able to avoid certain things, like saying too much about a space, defining its objects, defining how things are. So it's important that it is weak in that sense. Like that it doesn't define what objects are. This is really important because we want a weak discourse to free up the space for stuff which is not ontologically prescribed, right? Then there are the stuff that we need ontology to be able to do. So we want ontology to be able to be rational, to derive other propositions from initial propositions. It must have an internal power, right? And then there are the stuff that it's not that it positively doesn't do, but that it's incapable of preventing us from doing. So we want an ontology that at the same time, though it is logically sound, though it is avoiding defining certain things, it, for example, cannot know everything that it's possible to say about infinity beforehand. So for example, the whole theorem of the point of excess in being an event, the idea that, well, in the gap between, you know, a countable infinity and incountable infinity, there is a whole mass of practical, experimental hypotheses to be tackled that allows this to be developing, right? That's also very important. And that those three conditions, all of them come from the outside, right? If ontology was too strong, if there weren't things it couldn't avoid, it would be a substantialist ontology that kind of tells us what is necessary. And that's not what he's looking for. If ontology wasn't able to say new stuff, to derive new propositions, it wouldn't be the ontology that we want, because it would be, let's say, an irrational discourse. And it would kind of disseminate a certain idea of irrationality everywhere. Like, oh, to talk about being, you need to kind of break with rationality. And the third thing, which I think is also important, is that it mimics in its own incapacity to interdict certain things the very sort of form of novelty that we find everywhere. So the very procedure through which forcing can be proposed, the continuum hypothesis can be negated through an independent proposition, right? This is itself, let's say, an instance of the sort of thing that he wants procedures to be able to do. To be able to say something about the infinite without having infinite power, right? And classical logic for him is not a restriction, it's just a very crucial tool to allow for those sort of things. So a purely constructivist, intuitionist space where you cannot kind of explore the power of the excluded middle and non-contradiction is not a richer space, it's a weaker space. It's richer because nothing, like, I mean, it sees everything, it says everything, but it cannot say, I mean, it's incapable of expressing.
It is operationally less expressive.
Exactly.
Because you don't get to have proof by absurd, proof by contradiction. You don't get to have a lot of different operations you can have in Boolean space.
Yeah, so the idea of weak and strong, large and small, rich and poor discourses is not moral for Badiou. There's no intrinsic reason why you should always choose the richer discourse. Because the point is, what discourse thinks the thing that you want to think. It's not what discourse can think anything. Because sometimes when you gain in expressivity in terms of, let's say, richness of the discourse, you can lose in expressivity if the thing you want to express is this sort of fringe effect, right? For example, of novelty. So many times when people, like especially Deleuzian mathematicians, who asked him, why not talk about spaces rather than multiples? Like there's this really good mathematician called David Habouin, a French guy who works closely to him, but who is a Spinozist, a Deleuzian. He asked the same question. Man, why stick to multiples and not spaces? Like we can start from this and we have an even richer space. And Badiou's answer is usually in that area. Like you want to be able to think everything at once, so you don't need to think at everything historically. Like,
yeah, but I don't think this is just a question of discourse. Like we said earlier, it's a question of commitments. It's a question of two things: a question of presuppositions and question of maximality of thinking. So I think what is important in this case is if you're defining a discipline called ontology, like every other discipline, this discipline
is called mathematics. It's not called ontology.
Yeah, mathematics.
No, but that changes everything, because mathematics can enrich itself by moving to category theory, by developing all sorts of non-local topoi and things like this.
Yeah, I'm just...
Yeah, but that distinction is important in that case.
Naively equating mathematics and ontology, like his previous dogma that he had, that he refrains from. Like if you're thinking about foundation of mathematics, and we have a set of axioms, set of presuppositions that we start from, and then our aim for having these set of presuppositions in an axiomatic thinking is how can we think the space maximally? How can we think of this space, which is we call the foundational theory of mathematics maximally? And if this foundational space is can be thought maximally without operations such as absorbed or excluded middle, then why not?
Yeah, but that's why I mentioned the difference between mathematics and ontology. Badiou is the first guy to say, yo, mathematicians, do whatever. Let's see how variable mathematics can be. He would never say, oh, because the mathematics that I need to make composable science, love, art, and politics is this one, you guys shouldn't do something else or it's devalued. That's an argument for the philosopher who's looking for the best composable treatment of all these generic procedures. Now, the internal argument for mathematics is the one for the maximality of mathematical structure. We'll look for all sorts of logics, all sorts of spaces where forcing is valid, where it's not valid, spaces where, you can have everything. Sure, but that's mathematics developing the history of mathematics. The moment that you're looking at it from the commitment, which is not a presupposition at all, it's explicit, from the commitment to making composable the generic procedure. You're not looking for foundations. You don't care about foundations. You don't care about, set theory doesn't need to be foundational to be interesting for Badiou. It has the right expressive power, right? And if you find a different discourse, you will ask the same question. Can you restrict it in the same way to make it express the same thing? Not everything that is, maximality of thinking in ontology concerns making ontological properties thinkable. It doesn't concern making mathematical properties thinkable. And that's a distinction. So it's like saying, because he thinks the Maoist revolution created a new problem for thought, which is how is it that from within a revolutionary process, you might be able to subvert it from inside in order to keep it going, right? How can it be that there is a discontinuity inside the rupture? It's a crazy thing. But because he's interested in this problem, he would turn to politics and say, hey guys, don't try anything new because this is the only novelty politics need. No, he's going into this other issue. How do I make this compatible with what was happening in mathematics at the time, in art, and so on? That's the philosopher's explicit commitments. It's not the same as the maximality of thinking within the procedure. That's why I corrected the ontology mathematics thing. It's not for the stupid terminology. It's just because those are two perspectives. Those are different things, right? They need to be compatible. So if something is proved wrong mathematically, I mean, we're right now in the situation where there is a big debate on what axioms should be considered canonical concerning large cardinals and so on. So this might change something, but with regards to mathematical practice, he has absolutely no constraints. You say, do whatever, of course, but don't pretend like you can substitute your philosophical commitments for mathematical ones. And that's what I think he blames Deleuze and mathematicians for doing. Like, you guys don't want to have commitments. You don't have to want to have engagements. So you want to pretend like the development of mathematics is the same thing as the development of ontology, but it's not. There's a selection to be made which has pragmatic and extra mathematical commitments. I don't think that it changes anything in his approach to realize that, I don't know, homotopy type theory is able to recast that theory now with the new language. Well, if you can still restrict it to express the stuff that was expressible in being an event, fine, let's do it, right? You just don't want to let go of those, that connect. I mean, it's a weird connection, I agree. It's not usual to find somebody who's looking for restricted discourses as if that increases the value of that discourse. It's usually the inverse. And he himself has a different commitment when it comes to the procedures, right? But I think that's relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, I think this is a longer conversation because I hear what you are saying, that Badiou, if I recast what you're saying, is Badiou already has adopted certain philosophical presuppositions, and that is engagement, and that is generic, and that is basically the possibility of new through a theory of engaged practices. And then in order for laying out the foundation for these commitments, is using set theory as the powerful tool in order to basically provide the theory, the abstract theory of how new things can happen through engaged practices. But the fact that he's looking for the possibility of new in engaged practices is already made philosophical commitment. It's just finding the proper discourse in order to express this philosophical commitment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, without expressing more than that.
Right.
Yeah, it's the shopping cart thing we talked about, right? We don't know what's on Badiou's shopping list.
But
right?
But
when he's shopping for mathematical formalisms, we think he should get the richest or the top shelf math, but he might not need the top shelf math for what he's doing.
But I think,
yeah, and I don't think the commitment is to express the new. The commitment is to let the new be expressed.
Yes, I think that's a better way of putting it.
Which is very different, because if the commitment was to express the new, he would be a Deleuze. Because
that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Because you know, the new is inscribed within Deleuzean ontology. You cannot do something that is not new. It's almost like it's impossible to be, you know, not new in Deleuzean ontology. And this is kind of
You're not allowed to be boring.
So
Yeah.
this is kind of a big problem in a sense, right? You don't have like a criterion of distinction between something that is new and something that is usual, other than this moral indictment of, you know, the image of thought, these kinds of things, but, you know, which is always something external to the ontology.
Mm-hmm.
The image of thought is something that, I don't know, the understanding is imposing upon, you know, what is really going on, which is the production of the new.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's completely different. I think Badiou is going after something that will let the new be expressed, not something that will express the new.
Exactly, through the engagement itself. So a theory of engagement that allows new to be expressed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So having said that, so this notional definition, I guess I am probably grown to think about the relationship of Badiou with mathematics is a little bit more intrinsic than this. I think I've grown to think, and when I say I've grown, I probably did think that he's not just thinking about mathematics as a discipline like politics, but actually a discipline that allows for maximality of thinking and a template for how this maximality is possible, without which new cannot be expressed. So this principle of maximality, I think, which comes from the axiomatic framework, both is available in mathematics in its purest form or its only available form. It's a tool that has infinite capability. And hence, because of that, it allows us to think infinity. So there is a kind of relationship, a morphism between the tool and the ability to think infinity. Because it's not possible to think infinity outside of this, this axiomatic framework. So this privileged position for mathematics for Badiou, which I agree with, by the way, leads me to think that the mathematical presuppositions, philosophical presuppositions that he has is kind of found its, maybe he had it before he became so intrinsic involved with mathematics in this way, but found its perfect match in mathematics. So it is not like that his choosing of mathematics is just for its expressive powers. It is much deeper than that. That's what I'm trying to think, which then leads me to the question that he probably should examine this. So it is not a shopping cart, like in my view. It is more intrinsic relationship for Badiou, the relationship between the way that he thinks philosophy should conduct itself and the way that mathematics conducts itself is more intrinsic, as opposed to, now I have a philosophical commitment, I choose to express it in this mathematical language or another mathematical language. I don't know whether I can express it, but I think this is a longer conversation for me.
But yeah, I agree. It's a very important point. I just don't think that, I mean, there is that big distinction between the two things you just expressed. Like, one thing sounds very utilitarian or external to the stuff, and the other seems more, let's say, connected to, let's say, the interiority of the thing. And I have the impression that his approach is precisely the one where those two things coincide. For example, if you read Theory of the Subject, you see the idea that there is something like a political passage, that politics went a long way to find the idea of passing in a sort of indeterminate point where the state cannot tell you what exists, right? And rather than destroying the state because you are more powerful than the state, you can actually kind of change the perspective and treat as a dense space something that, you know, for the state only counts as, you know, structure. So that move from structure to topology, and that he makes in from the structural dialectic to the historical dialectic. There, I mean, that's something that's clearly already in his mind, and he even brings Cohen in as an example of that, and then spends 10 years to accept the fact that, I mean, that's not an example. That's the same thing happening elsewhere, right? And decides to have a theory of how these things happen in many places. So I agree with you that we can suggest a capricious nature to this, which is perhaps not a good way of expressing it. Everything was settled, and then he just found the best way to kind of pin it down. I don't think that's what we're saying, especially because he's choosing an expressive language which he doesn't control. That's the crazy of this guy. Like, his ontology is not under the control of philosophy. Like, it can say stuff he didn't want it to say, right? The fact that he says stuff that is very, let's say, harmonious with other of his commitments, that's unnatural. Like, there is an unnatural effectivity of Badiou's ontology. Like, how the fuck can you find, like, it's not a trivial issue. How the hell can you find a mathematical fragment that expresses properties which are harmonious with a very weird, very kind of strange approach in a capitalist world to stuff that he's saying about politics and stuff that he's also committed to in other fields? Like, that's actually quite miraculous. That's not in any way like a shopping cart and then I found it. Like, there was every reason in the world not to find it, right? So that says something about mathematics itself, which is that it is a procedure. That's how he would explain it, I think. I just have the impression that in the way that you're framing the issue, like, why not express everything categorically? Why not open this commitment to Boolean logics to bigger spaces? Like, that's something, but you totally agree with you if you're talking about the development of mathematics. If you're sitting down on your chair, about to write a philosophical book and asking yourself, how the hell am I gonna connect politics to art, to love, to science in such a way that I don't really say anything necessary about any of these fields, allow them to flourish in ways that I can't even think about, and still write something rational? Then I think that this shopping cart suddenly becomes like a miraculous encounter, right? It's still very powerful, but it's still weirdly pragmatic. Like, you don't need to assume that, or if he came with this commitment, he has an underlying or hidden presupposition. I think that there's a difference there, because that's his project from the beginning, like, explicitly, right? So I think that he wouldn't have a problem talking about this stuff that we're seeing in this chapter in a different mathematical language. The issue, I think, would be more like, okay, I think that's a different issue from asking why not loosen the constraints on ontology, right? And this question was asked before, like, why not hypersets? Man, you accepted that the event is a self-belonging set. Why not accept this in general? Right? I mean, why not use one of the non-well-founded set theoretical spaces like Axel studies? You could have that. Why not? Right? And his point is always the same. Like, sure, you enrich it mathematically. It's a larger universe that you will accept, but you will lose the thinkability of something which exists, which is the exceptionality of procedures. Like, so I think that's the sort of, it's a very subtle change from richness in mathematics to philosophical commitments, which I wouldn't call presuppositions because they are not hidden at all. which I mean justifies why this book begins with the theory of the subject explicitly. The Being an Event begins with an introduction saying, it was only when I realized that the independence of the continuum hypothesis had the structure, like the very weakness of set theory was inscribing into the system something that was useful to me. Like the fact that that weakness is there made it more relevant philosophically than less relevant, right? So while most philosophers in France in the 60s were interested in Gödel incompleteness theorems to show that some things are not thinkable, right? Oh, you cannot do this. You're limiting. Right? But you said, yes, that's amazing. Like, thanks, Gödel. Like, it's not a cold shower on his ambitions. On the contrary, it made it more expressive ontologically, right? But it's weird. I agree.
Yeah, plus we're only halfway through the book. We've only, like I said, only encountered the analytic portion of the book. And I think if we look at the synthetic part, the part where you're actually inventing things, that where he uses the formalism to describe like novelties, then I think it will also be clearer what, because from our perspective now, like, yeah, different formalisms look like they describe the same thing, but it's not necessarily true, right?
Yeah.
The theory of points is a specific, it models the structure of a decision.
Yeah.
And decisions are yes or no things for Badiou, right? So, I mean, that's an example of something that we haven't encountered yet. So that might make the difference also.
Yeah. Anyway, I think this is an important point for me. I guess I agree with Dennis that I don't want to jump the gun on this, but I just wanted to mention one thing in Gabriel's, what you said. You mentioned something, a very, very interesting example, the hypersets. And on this point, the difference between mathematicians who practice set theory or that branch of set theory versus the other branch of set theory is exactly what in Platonist Badiou we can say maximality of thinking. Because yes, by enlarging the space, by allowing sets that belong themselves, actually are foreclosing the possibility of thinking about things such as generic sets. So here, Badiou is opting for maximality of thinking, but not because of his philosophy, but because he's basically following the commitment within the mathematical practice to maximality of thinking.
I would frame it a bit differently and say mathematicians who opt for classical logical spaces without self-belonging or Mirmanov sets, they are doing that in their discipline. Just in the same way that, for example, Marxists who stick with the idea that class struggle exists and that there are, in some sense, a division in society, they stick with it because they can think more than saying that everyone is the same, everyone is mixed. Well, thank you, everyone is mixed, fine, but you now can think less. Thank you very much, right? So, but mathematicians who opt for this are opting because then they can go into large cardinal theory or whatever. But Badiou he's doing something similar, but he's not doing for the same reasons or to think the same thing. So I don't think that there is such a glue there. He's not doing what they did, right? If for his ontology, hypersets were better, let's say for his commitments, there is no such thing as ruptures or things like this, then he would have opted for the other thing. And it would be, for ontology, it would be maximum. So I think that distinction is subtle, but it's useful. Like the general idea of this operation, that some logical restriction might increase your expressive power or your investigative powers. I think that's a general point. But that might manifest itself differently as a mathematician continue to work on something. For example, for Badiou's perspective, Breuer suspending the excluded middle law is not ontologically interesting, and in some sense, it's not, let's say, an absolutely interesting decision. It's interesting because it gave birth to a lot of interesting mathematics, constructive mathematics, and so on. But it's not, and Heyting algebras, in fact, but it's not, let's say, absolute. It's interesting for that branch of mathematics. Like, if you turn it into an ontological commitment, this is only what's allowed, it's actually quite weak, right? So I think as a general method, true, but it doesn't mean that the strategies will always match what mathematicians are doing and what is ontologically.
I think the glue is the category of infinite. For Badiou, ability to think category of infinite is absolutely. So I think there is a glue, as a matter of fact, that mathematics that forecloses the ability to think of the category of infinite is completely out of the question for him.
As ontology, yes.
Not
as mathematics.
Not as mathematics. It is within the realm of mathematics, but for ontology.
Yes.
So for him, this provides a kind of glue between what his framework of thinking, or to your point, ontology. So there is a sort of glue between the two.
No, there is a choice that he makes that is similar to the choice that many mathematicians made with regards to a lot of points. I'm just saying that distinction is useful so that we have more tools to explain why mathematics might be richer. For example, category theory is infinitely more rich, and many category theorists are like bothered by the restraints of Badiou's selection. And it might still be philosophically interesting, because what counts as a restriction for somebody investigating what is mathematically possible might count as a power or as an interesting restriction from the perspective of somebody who has multiple commitments to abide to. And I think that it will show as we go along that, for example, the Boolean issue you were talking about has a crucial role to play, as Dennis was mentioning, right? It's conditional on the idea that new things can emerge out of local experiments, that we can confront a very complicated transcendental with a Boolean one. So, which is like making the situation pass a certain filtering, right? So even in the case of this huge, rich space of Heyting posts, blah, lattices, blah, 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 he will still say, classical logic is a powerful tool humanity invented. You shouldn't leave it to the Eurocentric monopoly of, modern guys. Like, it's you can use it to arrive at new information, and that's really good. So I don't know. I do think that we might be able to expand the reach there, because there's a whole discussion on experimentation, metric, valuations that seem to have a slightly less strict condition, like total ordering doesn't mean it's Boolean. So I don't know, there might be something to develop there. I just think that it's good to have that clarity with regards to the generic commitments of philosophy. It's not, he would never, I have the impression he would never be the philosopher that he is. Was he simply committed to ontology equals mathematics, like in that more immediate sense? Because the statement has conditions. If art exists, love exists, politics exists, and science exists, then some part of mathematics is ontology. I think that's the full statement, right?
Yeah, so should we end here, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I have some other stuff about the relation, exposure of the relation, but
it's a good place to start next week.
Yeah.
Do you think that the rest will take a session, or should I prepare for the next chapter?
I think I could present one more time, but it would be mostly conversation after a point,
That's
overview.
Yeah, I think that the universal exposition and the inexistence, they are really good points to hammer home a lot, because they are, let's say, those are the two properties of worlds that will guarantee some things that follow in the more eventual chapters, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're pretty much at the level of, you know, this defining a site in a worldly fashion, right? The class of what sites are in world. So it's weird. I find it very weird that the same chapter that has the most conservative concept relation is also the chapter with the idea of sites, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Are we still on Tuesday?
Yeah, I think we'll manage to.
But 10 p.m.
Yeah, 1 hour later.
Okay.
Next week, we don't know, right? We
next week we could start the same time, in fact.
We could start at 9 p.m. next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, whatever works.
Thank you, guys. This was very useful for me. This discussion was great.
Great debate.
We kind of started with a lot of people today because of the class, and we are now down to 5. But it's always kind of like that, right? When there's a lot of mathematics going on.
How much views do we get from for our videos? Do we know?
Sometimes I go there just I'm curious about it, but I don't remember right now. But it's not a lot.
Yeah, always like 50, 40. Yeah, but it's hard to tell.
Something like that, 40, 30, sometimes 50.
I'll look at the actual analytics, because, you know, visualizations mean people went in, saw how complicated and weird it was, and left.
Yeah, like watched 2 seconds and left.
But there is actually like the amount of minutes watched.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys.
I think there are some very interesting people who are following. I know of some people who are following the videos. There is a guy that does, there is a computer science guy that lives in Berlin called Anil Kavia. Very interesting guy. I wanted him to come, but he never shows up. But he's following the videos.
You know, this is a very bad time for somebody living in Berlin. Like it is past midnight, yeah.
Oh yeah, you're right. This is a problem.
Now you know.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is why he watches the video afterwards, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to taking like questions from outside. Maybe we can invite people to comment.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be like what Daniel is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that format. Yeah, the Cartani group.
Yeah, if you can set it up that way, that would be great.
Yeah, I wasn't able to show up still into the Karatani meetings. Just
neither could I yesterday.
I have too much on my plate, but I think now I have a little bit of slack for 2 weeks, something like that. Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not joining to the next week. Daniel is doing it by himself, and then we have, it's the last meeting, and then we have a plenary on the 15th. But it's kind of wrapping up.
So you're not doing the next one, but doing the one after.
No, the plenary I'm just hosting. My part is pretty much finished now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm definitely up for summarizing it in like 2 hours, the whole structure of the world history. If you guys are up for it, no worries.
Even more condensed.
Even more condensed, like.
You know, I'll have to give this, talking of that, I will have to give Hegel's Science of Logic, Gabriel already knows this, in 3 meetings of 40 minutes. Yeah, this is the reaction I was hoping for. So I kind of did an exercise like on Saturday. A guy who always comes, Mateus, he asked me to teach him the first book. I actually got to teach him the first book in half an hour, and he was satisfied. But it was kind of, okay, this is very
how to say, very condensed and very refined, because I'm reading this stuff in front of people for 2 years now.
I mean, the doctrine of being.
You gloss over a lot, of course. You gloss over a lot.
Taught him the doctrine of being in half an hour.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, it's feasible, but it's weird. It's a kind of a
And doctrine of essence in half an hour and doctrine of concept in half an hour.
Doctrine of essence, I think it will be more difficult, and doctrine of concept, I think it will be easier.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Guys, I need to run. Sorry.
Yeah, I have to go too.
Yeah, sorry, guys.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care, guys. Good
Take
meeting.
care.
Many kisses.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah.
Bye, Eduardo. I just saw you were there. You were holding on all the way to the end.
Yeah, Eduardo. How are you? Nice seeing you. Good.
I have some questions, but I prefer to send them by mail or by chat to you.
No,
Let's use our chat window.
Let's come in next time. You can make the question next time, like next week. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
See you
Okay.
guys. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.